Coming up on Network Africa. Former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak dies at the age of 91. President Tayyip Erdogan says 2 Turkish troops killed in Libya while backing the internationally recognized government in the North African states conflict. Plus, Guinea-Bissau's National Electoral Commission to recount the votes from the second round of the presidential election that took place on the 29th of December. Hello and a warm welcome to the program. I'm Teniola Shobowale. Former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak has died in Cairo at the age of 91. Mubarak spent 3 decades in office before a popular uprising swept the country in 2011. He passed away at a military hospital following reports that he had been taken to an intensive care unit following complications from a previous surgery in January. Let's take a look back at his life and times. Joining us now would be VOA's correspondent, Edward Yerenayan, to take a look at his life and times. Edward, thanks for joining us on the program. Mubarak, held a very firm hold on power for 3 decades. His death comes almost 9 years since that popular uprising finally forced him out of office. How are Egyptians reacting to his death?
Well, Tenny, there are many people who admire the former president and many people who hate him. So I guess it's a bit of one and a bit of the other. You don't see any outpouring of grief in the streets, but many of his former supporters, people who still support him in some ways, will tell you that he left Egypt in good shape. And then after he was ousted, the country deteriorated under the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood supporters, of course, will say that Hosni Mubarak was corrupt and that he presided over a long period of stagnation, and that his successor, Mohamed Morsi, was treated unfairly while he was let go, that is, President Mubarak.
The former president had long maintained his innocence and said history would judge him as a patriot who served his country selflessly. But I think something many people agree on is that he leaves a complicated legacy. What will the former presidents be remembered for the most?
Well, I think since I've been in Egypt for 13 years, and I remember when he was elected for the first time, he took power after the assassination of Anwar Sadat and was elected in 1987. I remember that election. I was here in 1987. He was actually very popular. And I guess as he got older, he became a bit more autocratic, but he was facing more Islamic fundamentalism than he faced initially. Well, of course, he was killed by an assassin's bullet. That is sort of part of the equation. So Egypt has faced periods of fundamentalism, terrorism, and I guess he would be remembered for stability. That's what I would say personally.
Yeah. One of those controversies, he was found guilty of complicity in the killing of protesters during the revolution. That conviction was overturned, though, and he was freed in 2017. Is there a perception among Egyptians that he sort of, died without facing justice?
Yes, there are some people who are saying that. Of course, I don't think that's the majority. I guess he will be judged by history, probably more than judged by a court. And the judge at one of his trials pretty much said that. And I think that's on the money. History will judge him. He has good parts to his legacy and bad parts. And I think I've heard people debate them, and people are pretty fair in their criticism if you actually listen to them.
Yeah, and when many people compare, the administration of former President Mubarak and then the current president, Fattah al-Sisi, many say that despite some political repressions during Mubarak's rule, he was more tolerant than al-Sisi. Would this be a fair comparison of Egypt under the two leaders?
Probably not, because Mubarak faced a period of insurgency back in the 90s. I don't know if that's perhaps too strong a word, but there was a lot of discontent and a lot of, I don't quite want to use the word insurrection, but there was definitely a war, low-level war going on. And once that was overcome, in the last years of his presidency, Egypt had become a very peaceful place. So it was easy to be sort of a benevolent dictator, if you want to put it that way. Whereas here, under President Sisi, he's been facing an incessant Islamic Muslim Brotherhood rebellion against him after the former President Morsi was overthrown, and there have been a lot of acts of terrorism across the country. So it's difficult to rule in the same way given different circumstances.
Just before I let you go, have there been any arrangements for a funeral?
The presidential office indicated that the arrangements were pending, but from what I'm hearing from Egyptian media, he will probably have a funeral tomorrow in the new administrative capital. They're saying at the new Tantawi Mosque, and probably following Islamic tradition, he will be buried that day.
All right, then, Edward Yerone, VOA's correspondent, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
My pleasure, Tenny.
As you heard there, speaking about Hosni Mubarak, we have more on his life and times. Let's take a look back.
Hosni Mubarak never expected to be Egypt's president. But when a very public assassination of President Anwar Sadat thrust the former bomber pilot into the job, he made it his mission never to give it up. His story became Egypt's story for the next 30 years, until finally his people found they could write it themselves in a 2011 Arab Spring revolution that consigned him to history. Mubarak served as president from 1981 to 2011 and played a major role in Egypt's recent history, ushering in an era of relative prosperity and close political and military relations with the United States, but also a time of corruption and economic polarization. Throughout his rule, he was a stalwart U.S. ally, a bulwark against armed groups and guardian of Egypt's peace with Israel. Violence by Islamists at home, including attacks on tourist sites and Red Sea resorts, remained a justification for the police state. In 1995, Mubarak survived one of several assassination attempts when Islamist gunmen fired on his car during a visit to Ethiopia. As president, Mubarak sent the army in to quell mutineers in the 1980s and also repaired relations with Arab states after Sadat's peace with Israel. In 1989, Egypt was readmitted to the Arab League, which moved its headquarters back to Cairo. But to the tens of thousands of young Egyptians who rallied for 18 days of unprecedented street protests in Cairo's central Tahrir Square and elsewhere in 2011, Mubarak was a relic, a latter-day pharaoh. The protests might have subsided, as it had before, had it not been for the sudden success of an uprising in Tunisia just a few weeks later, which also prompted protests against Egypt's ruler. Mubarak had been sentenced to life in prison in 2012 for conspiring to murder 239 demonstrators during the 18-day revolt. An appeals court ordered a retrial, and the case against Mubarak and his senior officials was dropped. He was finally acquitted in 2017. His overthrow led to Egypt's first free election, which brought in President Mohamed Morsi. Morsi lasted only a year in office after mass protest in 2013 led to his own overthrow by then Defense Chief General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who is now president. Despite the political repression under Mubarak's rule, he was considered far more tolerant than Egypt's current ruler and allowed opposition political parties and news outlets.
So other stories now. In Turkey, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says his country has lost 2 soldiers killed in Libya, where troops are supporting the UN-backed government of national accord. The GNA's fighting forces, led by General Khalifa Haftar, based in eastern Libya. General Haftar is backed by Egypt, Russia, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Jordan, while the UN-backed government is supported by Turkey and its ally Qatar. Meanwhile, the 2 sides in the conflict are both reported to have pulled out of planned UN-sponsored negotiations. Libya has been torn by conflict since the 2011 uprising, which ousted longtime leader Gaddafi. At least 20 people have been confirmed dead from a cholera outbreak in the northern gas-rich province of Cabo Delgado. The Mozambican health authorities are reported to have declared the outbreak in 3 districts. The Director of Health says the outbreak began on islands of the Cabo Delgado coast, where people have taken refuge in unsanitary conditions to flee from attacks by Islamist insurgents on the mainland. So far, 273 cases of the waterborne diseases have been diagnosed. As a rise in attacks sends civilians fleeing the northern regions nearing Mali and Niger, the UN Refugee Agency says a humanitarian disaster is unfolding in Burkina Faso, one of the world's poorest countries. UNHCR says there are now 765,000 people internally displaced, according to government figures, in a country of 20 million people. This represents a rise of more than 1,000% in just a year.
There is an alarming lack of resources to manage the needs of the internally displaced who are struggling to secure shelter, water and food. By the end of 2019, UNHCR had received just under 70%, a shortfall of $30.5 million of the funding it needs to adequately address the situation in the country. This is Diambede, leader of ethnic Kurmashe in the town of Kaya, when the first person came to him, explaining he fled for his life and now needed shelter. The community leader let him in. Many have since followed after being sent out of their homes by the armed groups.
As a chief, it is my duty to take in those who come to me for help.
For Renata Bugina, a displaced mother of 5, there is a real problem being faced.
He has helped by giving us food. His wives have helped by providing us with cookware. Because when we left, we couldn't bring anything. He really helps us, even with water. It's a real problem here. There is no water.
Getting help has enabled Renata to give help as well. She's been providing emotional support to women coping with the trauma.
The chief and his wives are really there to support me. They talk with me, and that's what helps me comfort other women and tell them there are no people here who can help.
UNHCR said rampant insecurity has had an adverse impact on the humanitarian response in the most affected areas, since humanitarian actors are now unable to reach many people in need in parts of the Sahel region. An emergency refugee housing unit shelter has been set up for the most vulnerable families, but there still remains an acute lack of safe, protected spaces.
Still ahead on the program. Politicians become the punchline in Kenya's booming comedy scene. We'll bring you details in a moment. Stay with us.